Going into the One Piece live-action adaptation, I didn't know quite what to expect, as opinions on the internet were polarizing, with half the people going like,
"This is the greatest series I've ever seen, Netflix has saved anime, the One Piece is real, and I orgasmed multiple times while watching this."
Which is a weird thing to say, and the other half going like,
"Yeah, this is terrible, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life, and it doesn't follow the manga."
And so I watched it and it was good. It wasn't an audio-visual masterpiece that I will remember for ages, but it was a nice adaptation and it was good enough, and it felt just a few steps short from being something truly special. Now, I have to admit publicly that I was wrong. There are manga that for their very nature I don't think could ever be adapted into live action, nor would I want to see that. For example, there are rumors about a One Piece live adaptation and it's just, why? It's a series about a pirate made of rubber with the most wackiest character designs ever. Just keep it in animation, please. I love One Piece and I enjoyed this adaptation, but going into this I want to make it very clear that I was not a believer. I still maintain the opinion that even though One Piece is a huge series with a lot of fans, adapting it into live action is a terrible idea. There are anime that I can envision being great live-action adaptations with the right people involved and the right budget, namely Monster, Psycho Pass, Vinland Saga, maybe even something like Death Parade. Generally speaking, character-driven anime whose fiction elements or sci-fi elements wouldn't be too hard to reproduce with CGI special effects. If you ask me what the hardest anime to adapt to live action would be, my first two would be immediately JoJo and One Piece. JoJo aside, maybe one day we'll come back to this video once again, One Piece has by far the cartooniest, wackiest, most nonsensical character designs and powers even for anime standards, from Luffy to Buggy to the even wackier characters that get introduced after the Grand Line. I never thought this would be possible to adapt into live action. Even though One Piece has some incredible emotional moments and is at various points peak fiction, it still has an almost slapstick comedy element to it that cannot be ignored, and this is especially relevant if you're caught up with the series. Never in my life did I actually think that they would actually approve this and that it would actually be good, so let's get right into it, starting off with what I liked, and then we'll go into my grievances. The casting, visually speaking, was for the most part very good. Zoro, Nami, Sanji and Usopp all looked like I imagined their characters would look like, with small changes like, for example, obviously Usopp's nose isn't going to be the Pinocchio nose, it just wouldn't make sense in live action. If anything, I would say that I imagine Zoro to be a little bit buffer, and inversely, I think Usopp in the live action is way too jacked. Usopp, especially in the Romance Dawn arc, is supposed to have noodle arms, but that's just details. I like that Sanji's more womanizer side comes across as more charming and less unhinged than in the original series. If I'm being completely honest, Sanji's performance was one of my favorites. I especially liked his dialogue scenes with Luffy and Zeph. They had a lot of chemistry together, and to me he was one of the best acted characters, although that's not really saying much. We'll get to that. Luffy pleasantly surprised me. He truly embodies that bubbly, adventurous, fun persona that Luffy has. If I think about the main crew, I think Luffy is probably the hardest character to cast, and they did a good job. As I've mentioned, I also really liked Zeph's actor. He was very good, visually speaking. To me, it was perfect. It was almost like a one-to-one with the manga. Zeph to me was one of the most believable characters, both physically and in his performance. Kobe pulled off the constantly scared look very well. He talks and looks like a nerd, which is what he's supposed to look like at this point in the story, before he grows up, hits puberty, and starts sweeping all the ladies and punching things really hard. Salute to my manga readers. Buggy, in my opinion, has a very different feel from the manga. This one here, visually speaking, is a lot scarier than even Arlong, who's supposed to be the big baddie of the season, and yet he still is quickly humbled into his more comedic side, which is what we've come to know and love Buggy for. My only nitpicks about the casting was, firstly, I wish that someone famous did a cameo as Goldie Roger, or Gold Roger, oopsie. I just think that the actor didn't quite have the gravitas for that character, and yes, I know that the scene is very short and probably inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, and that there was budget constraints for someone actually famous to play that role, but still, I don't think the initial scene hit as hard because the actor didn't quite have that imposing presence I expected of Goldie Roger. Initially, I also didn't like Garp. I was expecting someone bigger physically and with a less serious attitude. At the beginning of the series, Garp was more or less the generic authority figure and not the Garp that we know and love, who is, after all, still Luffy's grandfather and quite eccentric himself. I will say though that I slowly started warming up to the actor. As Garp became more and more unhinged as the series went on, I especially loved that scene where Luffy broke a part of Garp's ship and he just started laughing with his psychotic laugh. That was very good and I started liking Garp more from that point forward. Speaking of overly serious though, Zoro. And I don't know if this is a director's choice or the actor's preference, but Zoro is way too stoic the entire time. Yes, Zoro is generally speaking the most serious of the Straw Hats and he can be a bit edgy at times, but he is also a goofy Straw Hat just like the rest of them, and here he was way too serious the entire time. I can count through my fingers the amount of times that the actor smiled. If you portray this character in such a serious fashion, some of the jokes won't even land, like when he was lost back at Kaya's mansion, the joke just fell flat because it's so out of nowhere for such a serious character in this adaptation. As for the pacing, I enjoyed how they reorganized the arcs to make it more live-action friendly. Generally speaking, I don't really care about watching a one-to-one adaptation. First of all, that expectation is always impossible to meet for time and budget reasons, and secondly, I don't want to watch just a worse version of the manga. I want to watch a live-action adaptation that has its own different flavor and its own feel from the source material. Buggy's fight taking place entirely inside his circus makes it feel smaller in scope but more focused, and the smaller details like the audience watching completely traumatized made those scenes both funny and creepy, which fits Buggy in this part of the story. The fight with Kuro, also taking place entirely inside the mansion, also makes it feel more intimate, and this one had almost of a scary movie vibe. It was very funny to see, and I like that the smaller scope of these sets makes the characters more joined together, more bundled up, which in turn creates new conversations and dialogue scenes that we didn't have in the manga. I especially enjoyed Nami and Kaya's scene, which I don't remember happening. I may be wrong, please don't roast me, One Piece nerds, and also the kitchen scene with Zoro, Luffy, and Usopp. I will say though, some of the changes in the story made it more convoluted than it should. For example, against Buggy, they kind of let themselves get captured without fighting, only to then be put in a worse situation which they have to fight from anyway. So what was really the plan here? It's not like Buggy really even used the hostages and they just ended up fighting in front of them anyway, so it was kind of strange. And it's a bit strange to me that Arlong, who came from the Grand Line, needs a map to the Grand Line, and he also is bribing the Marines, so can't he just get a map from the Marines? It just doesn't make much sense, does it? And from a story standpoint, Kuro in the Netflix is not as intelligent as the one in the manga. In this adaptation, his plan had a lot of flaws, but I'll let it pass. Speaking of Kuro though, I do have to mention this. I know nothing about makeup, okay? Nothing at all. But what did they do to that poor man's face? Couldn't they have just casted a paler actor? Because his face looked so bloated with makeup, it just looked weird. I don't think the actor did a bad job, but the makeup for him was just so off-putting. The Baratie was very classy, dare I say a big improvement visually speaking over the manga. It seemed less like a restaurant and more like a fancy restaurant with a lot more class in it, and this is where the changes in the story started becoming more apparent. I didn't particularly care about Don Krieg being beaten off in some random beach somewhere by Mihawk, it's just not that deep to me, but I do think that the lack of surrounding wreckage and chaos made the fight between Zoro and Mihawk feel less epic. Arlong appearing at the Baratie is a very cool touch for me, because early One Piece suffers a bit from villain of the week syndrome, and this way it makes the East Blue Sea feel connected, like these islands are actually connected with each other, and Arlong is the common thread, and the Straw Hats aren't just going through a bunch of loosely connected islands who have no connection to one another. Finally, Arlong Park was cool, but this is one of the fights that I think got cut short, and there was really a lot more juice to be squeezed in this episode, so I felt a little bit deflated that the fight was as short as it was. The entire plotline of Kobe, Helmeppo and Garp being a constant threat in the Romance Dawn arc is interesting to me. I will say that once again, it makes things feel more connected. I won't dare question the genius of Oda-sensei, but it's not entirely clear to me how much he truly planned ahead at the beginning of the series. I think it's awesome to introduce characters like Garp so early in the series, and a character like Kobe really appreciates the extra screen time since the next time he appears is way later in the story. I'm still not sure how I feel about Garp letting Luffy go at the end and also contacting Mihawk to help him catch Luffy. It just felt strange. It's not entirely out of character, but it still doesn't feel like something that maybe manga Garp would have done. The whole final fight with Garp felt completely unneeded. I wish they devoted more time to Luffy vs Arlong, which was the bigger fight and the true emotional payoff of this season, but I understand why they did it. From a story standpoint, you can't really have Luffy give Garp the slip. It would just make Garp seem completely incompetent, which would be even more out of character, so there were really only two options. Either Garp voluntarily lets Luffy escape, or perhaps they could make use of a certain character which would only appear in Lockdown, which they did not adapt. Now, to me, the two biggest flaws in this series by far were the CGI and the acting. The CGI in this adaptation is mid at best, but that doesn't really take away much of my enjoyment from the series. You would need an unsustainable budget to ever adapt something like One Piece and make it look real, and even then, One Piece by design I don't think can ever look realistic in live action. In the anime, Luffy's fight scenes have a certain rubbery bounciness to them that is just impossible to replicate in real life without infinite money, and for the same reason, characters like Richie or Hachi were likely also not adapted for budget constraints. The sets and costumes were colorful and vibrant and felt alive, so I can handle a bit of bad CGI. The One Piece world is so cartoony by itself that even the bad CGI kind of fits the vibe. Something I cannot ignore though is the acting. The acting for this adaptation was not good, and please let's stop pretending that it is just because we like One Piece. The acting is for the most part mediocre and at times very bad. I enjoyed certain scenes and performances like Sanji and Zeph for example, and also certain Nami scenes along with some other characters to be fair, but most of the acting was rough and not quite what you would expect from a Netflix blockbuster. The moment that to me was by far the most botched in the live action adaptation, but this also shows my bias I know, is the fallout of the fight against Mihawk. Firstly, that fight was way less bloody or violent than it should, and Mihawk didn't stab him in the heart, which was the whole point, but I get that they didn't really want to screw with the age rating for this. Still, during the fight, Zoro was neither particularly bloody nor visually tired, so the entire scene felt so jarring. I was watching with a woman who has never watched One Piece before, and she was asking me why doesn't he fight anymore, why is he just giving up, and I have to agree with her. Not a single drop of sweat, not a ragged breath. I get that you can't really put too much blood or else the age rating may go up, but come on, you're fighting the best swordsman in the world, can you at least look tired? Just do some burpees before filming this. I don't understand why he looked completely fine. And then there's this emotional scene where the stoic Zoro promises Luffy with tears in his eyes that he will never lose again, and I love this scene, and I love Zoro. He's been my favorite One Piece character ever since I was a teenager 12-year-old, which maybe I still am in some aspects, and I just love this character in this moment. I love the fact that he's a swordsman with 3 swords, even though it doesn't make any sense, and this scene just sucked so bad in the live action. It was incredibly cringy. This should have had more emotion. I wanted more tears, more sweat, more spit, I don't know, something, but it felt so flat and nonchalant in the live action, it really didn't hit the emotional high I was expecting it to. I'm obviously biased towards this scene, but there were many other weird reads and performances at various points throughout the series. For example, when Arlong is attacking Zeph, Sanji is in the stairwell and does a weird read like, Zeph! We both laughed out loud because it was just so awkward. Another strange moment was in the Nami scene where she was crying and Luffy comes to comfort her. Nami's performance was pretty decent, I will say, but Luffy's subsequent performance was just strange. That scene where he says, "Of course I will," it just felt so awkward in live action, and in order to make that scene work, you just have to go full animal and be super confident, and it seemed like he wasn't entirely sure of what he was saying. It just felt awkward. So I say this isn't The Godfather, nor is it trying to be. This is One Piece, so have more over-the-top delivery, embrace it, have the anime feel we all know and love, but adapt that spirit into live action. Have bigger laughs, uglier crying, more over-the-top performances. Don't try to be super serious in a series where your main character is made of rubber. So this is my opinion on how to make the One Piece live action even better. Screw acting school, stop watching movies, start watching 90s wrestling promos where the guys are coked out of their mind. I need that kind of energy in this adaptation. Ooh yeah! And as a final note, I want to read some of the normie comments the woman made while watching One Piece for the first time. Why do they need a map? If the Grand Line divides the world, just sail south. Can't really argue there. Because they omitted the Calm Belt for some weird reason, the geography of One Piece, which already makes no sense in the manga, is even more nonsensical in the live-action adaptation. They didn't really explain why they couldn't just travel south into the Grand Line. Why do you need a map? Why do you need to go through a reverse mountain? They explained none of this. So Kuro is a mix between Freddy Krueger and the Flash. Can't really argue there. So, in this world, pirates just wear superhero costumes? Can't really argue there. I like Sanji more than Zoro. She was immediately expelled from the premises. So overall, One Piece is an enjoyable ride with obvious flaws. I'm just genuinely happy that this was actually adapted and that it's actually decent. And it made me nostalgic to watch, or let's be real here, read One Piece again. This was it for me today, folks, and ciao!